All right, moving through Matthew. Actually, not all of Matthew, right? We're just doing these discourses of Jesus in Matthew. And this morning we're going to start on Matthew 18. But before we do this, I'd like to go back. I don't have slides on this, so you'll either have to listen to me or pull out your Bible. But I want to go back to Matthew 16 before we do 18 because interestingly in Matthew's, the only gospel is Matthew. There's only 2 times in the Gospels that the word church is mentioned, and both of these are in the book of Matthew. That's interesting. The word for church, of course, in the Greek is the word ekklesia, which simply means assembly. But in these 2 situations, translators have determined that this is really talking about the church here, not about what we call a Jewish assembly or something to do with that. So it's kind of interesting how that's done because the Gospels, of course, were written late, right after the crucifixion in the 60 ADs. Gospels were written, and so there's some of these teachings of Jesus. Obviously, we're looking towards the kingdom, looking towards the church, and these are 2 instances in the book of Matthew where translators have used the word church here instead of the word assembly. With that thought in mind and that thought that we're looking ahead towards the body, towards the church. So it's kind of interesting. You know, there's no church. I've often said that in the Gospels. The church didn't exist in the Gospels. But in these 2 cases, it looks forward to that. And it's the only, like I said, the only 2 instances in the Gospels where the word church is used. So if you got your Bible, if you want to, or if not, you can just listen to me. But if we look at Matthew 16 this morning, is really an interesting discourse, right? Who do people say that I am? Who do they say that I am, right? Jesus asks his apostles. And of course, they answer him that question. Some say you're a prophet, one of the prophets, right? It's in Matthew 16, starts in verse 13. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you yourselves say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So this is the other case in the Bible, only in the Gospels, that we see the word church. It's also the passage that the Catholics kind of use to build the idea of papal authority. Upon Peter, the church was built. Of course, if you get into the Greek on this, and we studied this, you all probably read that. That's not really a good idea, a good translational idea, because there's 2 different words. The word Peter is rock, or pebble, stone, and then Petros. And then the word rock here is Petra, which is like a boulder or a big stone. But Peter says, you are Peter, and upon this rock. Well, the Catholic Church takes that to be, Peter is the rock that it's built on. That's where they build that papal lineage from Peter on. So, but like I said, it's kind of a play on the words. But he says, upon this rock, which is the confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I believe that's the rock we're referring to here, is the confession. He says, upon this confession, I will build my church. So that's one place that we see that. Like I said, that word there means assembly, but we understand contextually that we're not talking about the Jewish assembly. It's a future tense. I will build this. I will build my church. So he's looking ahead to the church. And also then, when we go to Matthew 18, this is the other place that we're going to see this word church used in the Gospels. Like I said, the only 2 places that we see the word church used in the Gospels. So when we look at Matthew 18, and I know I spent quite a bit of time roaming around in here and probably not done. You probably can get a sermon because I was started on that Sunday night. But this kind of worked out this way. Didn't really plan it this way, just kind of worked out this way. So you're going to get a lot of Matthew 18. So at Matthew 18, I started on this. Actually, this really gets into my sermon. I really didn't intend for it to be this way, but it is how it is. So Matthew 18 starts with pride, okay? Pride is the issue in Matthew 18. That's how it starts. It's about pride. Who is greatest is the question that's asked. Who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Actually, there's not a futuristic tense in verse 1. Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It's an interesting question asked to him, and Matthew says, by the disciples. Now we understand sometimes that term includes the apostles, sometimes it can include a few other people, but it's those closest to Jesus. They wanted to know who is greatest. Why would that be important? What are they wanting here? Do they understand the kingdom of heaven? Do you think? Here? Probably not, right? Probably not. So they're looking for this earthly kingdom, right? Earthly kingdom. And they want to know who's going to be the greatest in that kingdom, right? This is something that we see in the Bible. We talk about James and John's mother coming to Jesus, said, let one sit on my right, one sit on your right, one sit on your left when you come into your kingdom. And he says, you don't know what you ask. You don't know what you're asking, you know. You don't understand it. But once again, we get this before him, and Jesus calls a child to himself and set him before them. And he said, truly I say to you, unless you're converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So did he answer the question or not? No, not to them, right? So why does he say that? Why does he tell them? It's interesting, isn't it? He says you won't even enter it. In other words, you can't even get in, right? You can't even get in. It's not a matter of who's greatest. If you're not like a little child, so what's the rebuttal? I mean, so, you know, if you're in the middle of this conversation, what's the start of this conversation? Who is greatest? What's that about? I mean, that's pride, right? You want to be the best, biggest, the strongest, the best. You want to be the one that's on the right hand of the throne, right? You want to be that guy. And then Jesus says, that will not even, if you have that much pride, if you're that prideful about it and you won't even get in. He says, you shouldn't be thinking about who's going to be the greatest. You ought to just be thinking about if you're even there, if you're even in it, you know, if you're even in it. And so Jesus really turns the conversation in a totally different direction right away. He's not talking about the greatest. He's just simply talking about getting into the kingdom, right? And he says, if you're not converted and become like children, you will not enter. But then he answers the question. Whoever then what? Humbles, the opposite of pride. Pride was at the beginning of this. Jesus says, whoever humbles himself as this child, he is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. To humble yourself as a child, what do you think that means? Whoever humbles himself, this is just a random kid, right? There's nothing special about this kid. Jesus picks this kid out of the crowd. This is just a random child, right? This could be anybody's child. Jesus puts that kid up there. He says, unless you humble yourself as this child. So what's the metaphor here? What do you think that means? How is a child humble? Right, they don't have any preconceptions. That's a big thing for them because these are Jews who have a lot of preconceptions about who's worthy, who's not worthy, who can go, who can't go. Yeah. Yeah, they're very forgiving, right? We know that. Children are extremely forgiving. Children have the ability to, you know, forgive you and move on, and more so than we do as adults. They tend not to hold a wrong as good as an adult does. So that's a big thing, right? What's humility, though? What is humility? What does it mean to be humble? If you're a humble person, what does that mean to have humility? See others as greatest as yourself? How about in a conversation? If you're in somebody that has humility in a conversation, how do they, when you talk to somebody, in a conversation. How do you project humility in a conversation, do you think? Is that, huh? Fewer eyes. Pronouns are huge about humility. Pronouns are huge, right? If you use I a lot, that points to you having that authority, you being able to do that, right? I think Jesus was really good at humility, and I think people don't often see that in Christ, but I think there's conversational traits that Jesus used that really are good for us to use, that really project humility. Do you have any idea what that is when you converse with someone? How do you project humility in a conversation? Speaking parables. Let them talk, right? I mean, that's one of the greatest things that you can do in a conversation. And I'm very bad about that. I'm bad about talking over people. I'm bad about finishing people's sentences. That's me, you know. I will do it. I mean, if you don't spit it out, I'm going to tell you. You know, I'm going to tell you what you were going to say. You know, so absolutely to take time to let people speak to you, right? To listen. Humility means you value what they have to say, right? That's part of being humble. If you're a prideful person, or you think you've got it all figured out, you don't want to listen to what they have to say. You just want to talk. Humility, part of being humble in a conversation, humility is being interested in what that other person has to say, right? So how else do you think that you do that in a conversation? These are things I need to know, because I struggle with all these things. I'm trying to be a lot better in my old age. I really am. Yeah. Huh? Right. I want your opinion. That's one of the biggest things in a conversation. If you really want to be humble in a conversation, you say, what do you think about that? What's your opinion? What do you think? Jesus was really good about that, wasn't he? Jesus really good about answering questions with questions, right? Putting it back on their side of the table, right? You answer me. You know, what do you think, right? Jesus did that a lot, didn't he? You matter of fact, when the rich young ruler came to Jesus, what do you hear? What do you say, right? So it's interesting how Jesus would turn that conversation around that way and would think it about them, right? About what they want. And I think all those are things that project humility in our life. And I think that they're very, very important aspects. Most people like to talk about themselves. Would you agree with that? Most people like to talk about themselves. And if you give them the opportunity to do that, that projects humility on your part, that you're able to listen intently, listen respectfully to what another person has to say. I'm good at that sometimes, and sometimes I'm not so good, I got to tell you. And there's certain people in my life that I'm really not good with it. But I will just say that it's a good trait. And that's humility. The humbleness of a child is the greatest, Jesus says. So, but what about 5? Is he talking about children there? Who's he talking about there? Huh? Who are we talking about in 5? Yeah, he says you receive one such child. Like what such child? Huh? A convert, a child in the kingdom, right? Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. What's annoying about children? Who wants to start? Not all of you put your hand up at one time. I mean, I love children. Y'all know that. So don't take me wrong. But what's annoying about children? Demand attention, right? I mean, they love it. They want it. They desire it. They want you to give them all the attention, right? And they want you to hang their little drawings up on the refrigerator and tell them how wonderful they are and they're the best artist in the world. And right? They want that. They desire it. They want attention. Do you think adults, do you think that adults can be that same way? You know? Do you think that's maybe a sign sometimes of what? When adults really desire a lot of attention, we might say that they're needy, prideful. We might say they're immature, right? When we might say that about somebody that always wants to be validated, always wants attention, always wants you to, to notice what they do, always wants to be recognized for what they do. We would maybe say that's a little immature sometimes, possibly, right? Because we understand that maturity means basically that we are able to function on our own and we really don't need validation, right? Children need a lot of validation. Would you agree? Would you all agree with that? Children desire a lot of validation, right? If you want your kids to clean their room, then just tell them how good they're out. Tell them how good they are at it, right? Tell them, if you want them to finish their meal, tell them how great they are at eating or cleaning their plate. Or, kids want that. We need to validate them. And when we give them that validation, they desire our approval. Would you agree with that statement? Children desire our approval, right? And do you think that a person who is new to the church, a person who is a babe in Christ, a person who's a new convert, and don't you think they desire our approval? Don't you think that would be something that they desire, right? They would desire that, I would think, right? They're maybe more immature in the faith than other people. Maybe they desire more validation. Well, you sure did a good job helping with the fellowship meal. I really appreciate how you helped with the food bank, or I really like how maybe they need that a little more than people who have been in the church for 30 or 40 years that don't really, we don't really need that. We don't really need somebody to come up and pat us on the back and say, boy, it's not that we don't appreciate that. We do, but we're going to keep doing it, whether somebody comes up and pats us on the back and says, oh, you did a really good job or not. Whereas somebody that's new in the church, a new convert, they really need that validation. We really have to strive to give them that validation, right? I think they want to please God. I think when they're a new convert, they've come into Christ, they've acknowledged that Jesus Christ is God's Son, they've been baptized into Christ, they want to be pleasing to God. Children inherently, I think, want to please us. I'm not saying they always do. I'm just saying I think children have a desire, for the most part, to please their parents. They want to please us. They want us to be happy with them. And I think that a new convert in Christ is the same way. They want to please. They want to do that. They want to fit in. I think children want to fit in. Do you agree with that? Children like to fit into the group. They want to be included, right? If you've ever had kids, one of the worst things is for your kid to be excluded from a group or excluded from a club or excluded from somebody. It breaks their heart. They want to be part of that, right? Yeah. Right. Well, we all have different levels of maturity throughout our life, and I think in Christ it's the same way. All of us have different levels of maturity, where we're at. And, so like you say, you really can't put a timeline on that necessarily, just like children all mature at different rates, Christians all mature at different rates. And, you really can't put a time frame on that. See, Jesus is introducing, and I don't know if you really see that in this text, but this is a new idea for them. And let me try to explain that to you a little bit. You didn't opt into Judaism. You didn't convert into Judaism. You were born into Judaism, right? There were no new converts into Judaism, really. There were some proselytes, but let's face it, they always kind of held them at arm's length at best, They never really invited them into the bunch, So the idea of this is almost foreign to them in a way, People were born into Judaism. You were raised up with it. You grew up in it. You just were a Jew, unless you decided you weren't going to be. You were, that was how it was. This is kind of foreign. This is why when you see Matthew 18, you start looking towards the kingdom, looking towards the church, and not Matthew 18, Jesus isn't talking about what exists. Jesus is talking about what is to come. Because this doesn't fit contextually with what exists at the time. It doesn't. This is a different world. There's not new converts. Well, there might be, like I said, proselytes, but it's a little different idea than what we would consider. They're not in the kingdom. Jesus talking futuristically here. Who will be? Who's coming? What's coming, you see? So it's a different concept for them. They never really thought about trying to keep somebody in a faith, try to keep a person in a faith, because they were that. Does that make any sense? You were that, You weren't like you were trying to keep a convert. They didn't really care about people converting into Judaism. I don't think that was a big on their list, They didn't really care about that. So this is a totally new idea to even think about, I need to try to keep little ones in the kingdom. That's a new thought. It's a whole new theory. But Jesus, in 6, he really gives us this is as bad as it gets. I don't know if you understand the gravity of 6, but 6 is as bad as it gets. It means it's better for you to die than to let one of these stumble. That's really severe. This isn't just one of those things like in passing, like I wish you were dead type thing. This would be better for you. It'd be better for you to die, Jesus says. That's pretty severe, isn't it? Don't you think? In 6? Y'all agreeing with me here? That's pretty severe, isn't it? It'd be better to be dead than to let someone stumble, right? So, boy, I've been in the church a long time. I have. A lot of years. And I've seen a lot in my life. I have. I've seen a lot of people come, seen a lot of people go. I've seen a lot of stuff said that should have never been said, done that should have never been done. I've had it done to me. I've had it done to my wife. I've had it done to my kids. I've had stuff said to them over the years that should have never been said in a church building. We've been judged before for a lot of things in my life over the years, not recently, but early on when we first became members of the church. We got judged for a lot of things. We got judged for where we went. We got judged for what we wore. I've seen people chastised in the foyer for clothes they had on or didn't have on or lack of or whatever. I've had to run interference in my life many times because I knew people that were going to get people for certain things, and I would see it during a church service, and I would know that if I didn't get to them before somebody else got to them, something was going to happen. I've done that many times in my life. I have seen so many things happen that would fit this verse that I can't even begin probably to tell you all these things. Sometimes it was all right. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't. I'm just going to tell you. And it was a lot of things that in the end of the day did not really make a hill of beans, just to use an old statement. Stuff that really did not matter. Really did not matter. There is ways to deal with people, and there is ways not to deal with people. There's ways to do things in love, and there's ways to do things not in love. There's ways to speak and ways not to speak. There's some things that should be said and some things that should never be said. As Christians, you and I need to be able to discern those things. Not that I'm always perfect, and I have been at the brunt of some of the problems. But this is a very serious idea, very serious verse. When you see not everybody is going to dress and act and talk and be like you think they probably need to dress, act, talk, and be. I'm just throw that down on you right now, right? Doesn't mean everybody's going to do what you think or act just like you think. Doesn't mean every teenager that comes in this building is going to be dressed just like, or maybe adult is going to be dressed just like you think they ought to dress, right? Some people might think that it's a sin to go wear a bathing suit. Some people might be all right with it, you know. Some people might think your dress ought to be below your knees, and some people might be all right with it, and some people think that, you know, you shouldn't wear low-cut jeans. I've seen that, and some people are all right with that, you know. There's a lot of stuff in this world. You need to choose, as Christians, we need to decide, you know, what hill we want to die on, you know. That's the best way I know to put it, you know. At the end of this life, at the end of the day, most of that stuff's irrelevant. People are going to come around to who people need to be eventually. If we love them, if we teach them, if we keep them here, we're going to be able to make a change. If we run them off, we're not. I don't know how else to put it, you know. If you run them off, you're never going to change them. Just fact, right? Yeah. 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 Stumble means to do something to someone in such a way that it causes them to fall. You know, it doesn't mean that they get upset a little bit or they grumble a little bit or they kind of get bent out of shape. That's not what this is talking about. To stumble means that we do something to someone basically that makes them fall away from the faith, something that they can't get over. We hurt somebody's feelings. And generally, it's not big stuff. It's not like you committed adultery. You know, that's not the stuff we're talking about here. We're not talking about calling out, you know, a huge sin or somebody that does a big, because in my life, in my experience in the church, that's never been the case. I mean, I've been through adulterous situations in the body before, 2 or 3 times in my life, more than that. I've been through adulterous situations with people in the church several times. I've seen marriages fail. I've been through divorces. I've been through all that. And you know, in all those cases, every case that I've ever been into that was an adulterous case, we didn't lose anybody over it. You know, I mean, we might have lost them in a particular congregation that I was in, but we didn't lose them. They were still in a church. They just went to church in a different town because they were ashamed of coming, but they never, in my experience, we never lost them. They never fell away from the Lord. They always came, they repented. You know, their marriage might have ended, but we kept them. You know, we kept both of them. We even had cases here where we had divorced people that were married to each other sitting on each side of this congregation several times since I've been here. That's happened. Y'all probably are aware of that. You know, we've had that several times in this congregation. So, you know, that's never really cost us anybody. It's hardly ever the big stuff. It's the little stuff. You know, it's the little stuff. And, you know, but everybody reacts differently. They're just like little new Christians especially, and even sometimes mature Christians. You know, it's easy to break their heart. You know what I mean? I mean, that's what you do. You break their heart, you know. It's not that and when you do that, you lose them. And it's just so hard. And in the church, we get criticized for that. I'm sure you've heard them comment your whole life. You know, well, all you down there think you're better than everybody else, you know. We take the brunt of that. We take the criticism for that, don't we? Over and over in our society, you know. Well, you're too good for everybody, you know. You're too good. You know, I've had people in this town say, well, I'm better than anybody down there. You know, you're a bunch of hypocrites down there, you know. I hear that stuff. I mean, we probably all hear that stuff. You know, we take the brunt of that. And it's not fair. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's true. But we take the brunt of those remarks and those comments because a lot of people over the years that have been hurt, that's what they tell people. Well, them down there, you know, well, they got onto me, you know, they got all over me for what I was wearing or how I was dressed or you know, how I wore my hair or something, you know. You know, I don't know the answer to all these things. You know, it's easy for us to get offended by people's actions, by things they do, maybe by things they wear. Maybe to us it's not right. I don't know. Maybe we have a big problem with it. Is it our problem or is it or is it a sin that we need to address? I think, that's questions we have to ask ourselves. Is it our problem, or is it a problem? I think it's a hard line sometimes to figure out. I know I seem to be talking in circles here, and I really apologize. There's just a lot of things in my brain right now over the years, over 40 years of being a Christian. A lot of things rolling around inside my brain, things I wish I could go back and fix. Yeah. Well, I think it's better that way than it used to be. But yeah, I definitely I've literally spent entire church services guarding people from people, making sure certain people didn't get a hold of them because I knew it was going to be an issue. So I understand that, and it really has affected my worship a lot of times because I knew that, and I would purposefully, way before I was ever preaching, but I would always watch and I would always get in the foyer. I always catch those people, or the people I knew might say something. I would tie them up purposefully so I knew they couldn't get to somebody else to say something, because I knew that was coming. And the problem was I loved them all. I mean, I loved the people that I knew were going to say something, and they were dear to me, dear Christians. I loved them with all my heart, but I knew them too. I knew them. I knew exactly what they were going to say, exactly how they were going to react, and I just took it upon my mission to try to make that not happen. But then again, I've caused problems too. So I think it's a growth process. In 7, he says there's going to be stumbling blocks, the world, right? And it's inevitable, right? And I think that's true. You're never going to please everybody. It's impossible to do it. But that's a woe. I don't know if you know about woes in the Bible. Woes are terrible things in the Bible, right? When we get into Matthew 23, the 7 woes, 8 woes, but 7 if you take away the textual variant out of it. But the 7 woes of Matthew 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, woe to you, woe to you. Woes are big in the Bible. It's like, whoa, woe to you, it's bad. We don't use that word a lot anymore, but it's like, it's bad, right? Woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes, right? And then we get into this, it's really funny, isn't it? This little thing, I was looking at this morning, actually, because of this morning's sermon. I don't think I'm going to use it in this morning's sermon. Boy, this morning's sermon is going to be a tough one. Anyway, but I was looking at this in Matthew 5, right? If you looked at that in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says to cut off your hand, right, pluck out your eye. Remember that, the Sermon on the Mount? Isn't it interesting that it pops back up in 18? In 5, what does it immediately follow in the Sermon on the Mount? Does anybody in here know that? What does that immediately follow in the Sermon on the Mount? Somebody open up Matthew 5. What does that immediately follow in the Sermon on the Mount? Y'all know that? You want me to help you? Keith's looking. Well, I think it's fascinating. I was actually looking at it this morning, and it's interesting. What follows, what this actually follows. Go to Matthew 5 and 27. Read 27 and 28. Yeah. And then what follows that? Amazing. What does it immediately follow in the Sermon on the Mount? Follows what? Adultery and lust, right? Isn't that what it follows? If you see a woman, we miss that, don't we? We always miss that. People stop right there. If I see a woman and lust after, I've already committed adultery in my heart. We've heard all these sermons about this, right? Means you want to desire her, right? Don't just look, you desire her, right? But we miss the next part because he just said, if you look at her, right? He says, if you look at her, right? Isn't that what he says? He says, everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has committed adultery in his heart. And then immediately in 29, he says, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. You see that in Matthew? It immediately follows that. We don't often look at that when you look at Matthew. You don't see how that progresses. So Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, he says your eye, right? It's with your eye. If you look at her, and then he says, if that causes you to stumble, take your eye out and throw it away, because it's better for you to go blind than it is to go into hell, right? I mean, he's saying it's better for you to physically maim yourself than to sin. Would you agree with that statement? He says it's better for you. It'd be better for you to be lame on this earth than to be dead eternally. Yeah, he's saying it's what we're talking about. See, it's interesting in 8. So go back to the Sermon on the Mount. So he says, you look at a woman with lust having her heart, and then the first thing he says, if your eye caused you to stumble, tear it out, right? But look at Matthew 18. So he says, woe to the one who stumbles. But listen to 18. You see the difference in 18? You see the start of 18? It says, if your hand or foot causes you to stumble. You see, he doesn't put the eye first in 18. See, the eye is first in the Sermon on the Mount, because in the Sermon on the Mount, what the problem was your vision. You saw a woman, you lusted after her. If that's the case, it's better for you to be blind than to do that. But in Matthew 18, he doesn't start with the eye. He starts with your hand or your foot caused you to stumble. Cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be cast into the eternal fire. Then he says, then he throws the eye back in there at the bottom, because chances are we're not going to cause somebody to stumble by what we see. We're going to cause somebody to stumble by what we do. You see, by what we say, by what we do. So he changes the order in Matthew 18. So go ahead, Sam. It means you don't look. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, you know? If you've got a problem with that, don't look. I mean, that's what he's saying, you know? Don't look, you know? Don't do it. I mean, the Bible's about self-control. It's about being able to control our body, control what we do, control our actions, control our speech. You know, I'm with you. I don't think anybody in here is going to pluck their eye out. I just don't think we're going to do that. I think it's probably happened in the course of history, or somebody has done it to somebody possibly because of this verse. I could literally see that happening. I don't know that for a fact. I know they do cut people's hands off in a lot of countries because they steal, and I'm sure there's some basis in this. I don't exactly know, but I think it probably fits contextually with what's going on here. People that steal, they cut their hand off because they can't steal. If you ain't got a hand, you can't steal, right? If you don't have eyes, you can't lust. You can't look, right? The concept here is self-control, bodily self-control. This is such a big thing that it's better for you to die than to do this. And if that's the case, then you need to control yourself. You know, control what you say, control how you say it, control your actions, control what you look at. Be in control of your body. You know, I think we live in this world that everything is so in front of us all the time in an instant. I'm getting into my sermon a little bit, and we're out of time. But I think we live in this world that everything is so in front of us in an instant that our level of self-control as a Christian has to be 10 times what it was 10 years ago. Wouldn't you agree with that? You know, we're bombarded with it on every level, every day, everything we turn to. We see stuff that we shouldn't see. Would you agree with that? We see it every day. It's on our phone, it's on our feeds, it's on the television, it's on billboards, it's everywhere. You and I live in a world that more than ever in our lives challenges us as Christians to be able to control ourselves. And don't you think that's the hardest thing on earth to control? I do. I think the hardest thing on earth to control is me. And yet Jesus is calling us to this level of discipleship and this level of self-control that it's almost hard to attain. It really is. You know, when you live your life in fear of offending someone, which often I do, much of the time I do, live your life in the fear of offending someone, it's a hard life. It's tough to do. I promise you. You know, when you get up and speak every day and preach, and you know one thing you say, one phrase can cost you grief beyond imagination, and phone calls in the middle of the night, staying on the phone for about 2 or 3 hours with people, it's pretty tough. When you speak as much as I speak, chances are you're going to say something that somebody's going to find offensive. Whether I say it, whether it's how it was taken, it's going to happen. Part of the job, promise you. And it's a, you know, I carry that burden. You know, I know that I can run somebody off in a minute. I can say something from the pulpit, and maybe you might hear it a certain way, or somebody might hear it a certain way, or take it a certain way. And there's a really good possibility, if it's somebody that just walks in here that I don't know very well, they could walk out these doors and say, you know what that preacher said? I'll never go back. You know? So don't think this isn't real to me. This is real as real can be. This verse, this passage in Matthew is real to me. I live this every day of my life. It seems like I live this. Me and Susie talk about these things all the time, right? Why aren't they there? What did you say? What did they hear? What did you do? You know, how did you act? You know, we have to think about that continually. As a minister, as somebody, I have to think about that all the time, who I'm with, right? Make sure I'm not alone with people. Make sure there's somebody there. I have to think about how I hug somebody, or how I shake somebody's hand, or how I pick up a child, or how I do anything. All that stuff to me is under scrutiny continually by people. And you know, I think as Christians, we walk a hard line. You know, it's easy for somebody to look at something you do and judge you for it, and maybe not even know the situation. So this is real. This is very real to me. I don't know how real this is to you, but to me, this is very real, right? And this morning, with this sermon I'm preaching this morning, it is like 10 times more real than it usually is in my lifetime. So anyway, you know, we just got to love each other, right? We got to have some tolerance. Would you agree? For each other, some forgiveness. Would you agree? For each other. We have to understand that we're all human and we all make mistakes. Would you agree? And that it's only for the grace of God that any of us are going to heaven. Would you agree with that? You know, and we have to live that life. You know, so yeah, we're going to spend some time here because I need to spend time here. Because, like I say, this is a passage of Scripture that's continually in my mind, continually in my mind. So thanks for your time this morning.